It begins with a contradiction so quiet, most people never stop to question it. Athens, 2010, the air feels heavier than it should. Not physically, but economically. A man stands outside an ATM, staring at the screen as if it might change its mind. Withdrawal limits. Again, behind him, a line forms not impatient, but uncertain. Across the street, a small shop is closing. Not for the day, for good. There's a strange silence beneath the noise of protest, a realization spreading slowly. Something invisible has broken, and no one fully understands how now cut. Frankfurt. Same morning. Glass towers reflect a sky untouched by crisis. Inside, traders watch screens, numbers moving but without panic. Coffee machines hum. Conversations continue. Stability isn't even noticed, because it's expected. Two cities. Same currency, two completely different realities. And that's where the story begins. Because money, at its core, is supposed to unify. It standardizes value. It creates a shared language of exchange. €1 in Athens is supposed to mean the same thing as €1 in Frankfurt. But here's the problem. It doesn't. Not in practice. Not in consequence. And that raises a question that feels simple. Until you try to answer it, how can a single currency create two completely opposite economic realities at the same time? The obvious explanation points toward mismanagement, overspending, corruption, weak governance. But obvious explanations are often the most dangerous ones because they give you an answer before you've asked the right questions. What if the euro isn't broken? What if it's doing exactly what it was designed to do? That's where the discomfort begins, because the euro is often presented as one of Europe's greatest achievements, a symbol of unity after centuries of division, a system designed to prevent conflict by tying economies so tightly together that separation becomes unthinkable. And on the surface, it worked. Borders faded, trade increased. Stability, at least, initially seemed real, but beneath that surface, something else was forming, something slower, less visible, something structural. Think of the euro not as money, but as a shared heartbeat. Now imagine connecting that same heartbeat to multiple bodies. Some strong, some fragile, some growing, some already struggling. A heartbeat that stabilizes one body could overwhelm another. A rhythm that accelerates growth in one region could suffocate another. Because the euro doesn't adapt, it imposes, it assumes that different economies can move in perfect synchrony. But real economies don't work like that. They breathe differently. They expand and contract at different speeds. They respond to pressure in different ways. Before the euro, countries had something like economic instincts. If their economy slowed, they could lower interest rates. If exports became too expensive, they could devalue their currency. If crisis hit, they could respond independently. These weren't perfect tools, but they were tools. The euro removed them completely and replaced them with something far more rigid, a single policy, a single rate, a single response for multiple realities. And here lies the first paradox. A currency designed to eliminate economic crises may have made them inevitable. Because when you remove the ability to adjust, pressure doesn't disappear. It accumulates quietly, like air inside a sealed container. At first, everything looks stable. Nothing moves, nothing shifts, nothing seems wrong. But inside, the pressure builds, and the longer it builds, the more violent the release becomes. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn, because none of this was a surprise. Long before the euro was introduced, economists warned about exactly this scenario. They argued that a shared currency, without deeper political and fiscal integration, could create dangerous imbalances. They predicted divergence instead of convergence. They saw the risk, and yet, the project moved forward. Why? Why would policymakers ignore such fundamental warnings? Why would entire nations willingly give up control over their most powerful economic tool? And more importantly, who benefits when that control disappears? Because when Greece fell into crisis, something else happened at the same time. Elsewhere in Europe, stability held. Exports increased. Industries strengthened. Confidence remained. Loss and gain happening simultaneously. Which creates a question that feels almost uncomfortable to ask. What if the euro was never meant to work equally for everyone? Not as a failure, but as a system with uneven outcomes built into its design. Because history has a pattern, the most powerful systems are rarely designed to be fair. They are designed to be stable for some and manageable for others. And the euro. It might be one of the most sophisticated examples of this pattern ever created. A system that doesn't collapse under pressure, but redistributes that pressure across countries, across populations, across time, so that instability never disappears. It simply moves. And if that's true, then the euro isn't just an economic tool, it's something far more complex, a structure of control, a mechanism of balance, a system that shapes outcomes without ever appearing to do so. But to understand how something like this could exist, we did have to go back not to the moment the euro was launched, but to the deeper forces that made Europe believe it needed something like this in the first place. Europe, 1945, not a continent, but a scar. Cities reduced to skeletal remains, railways twisted into silence, economies not just weakened, but erased, and beneath the physical destruction, something even more fragile had collapsed. Trust. Because Europe had seen this before. Of rivalry, economic instability feeding political extremism, nations competing, currencies fluctuating, crises spilling across borders like uncontrolled fire. War wasn't just a political failure, it was an economic one. And from that realization, a new idea began to form, not overnight, but slowly, deliberately. What if peace could be engineered, not through speeches or treaties alone, but through structure? What if economies were tied together so tightly that conflict would no longer make sense? Because if your prosperity depends on your neighbor, destroying them becomes self-destruction. This was the beginning of European integration. But it didn't start with currency. It started with something more fundamental: coal, steel, industry. The European coal and steel community wasn't just an economic agreement, it was a strategic one. These were the raw materials of war. By placing them under shared control, Europe wasn't just coordinating production. It was limiting the possibility of conflict, and it worked. Slowly, trust began to rebuild. Trade expanded, cooperation deepened. Institutions formed. Each step felt logical, almost inevitable. But beneath this gradual integration, a larger ambition was growing: the idea of a fully unified Europe, not just politically, not just economically, but monetarily, a single currency. At first, this idea felt distant, even unrealistic, because money is not just a tool of exchange, it's a symbol of sovereignty. It represents control over inflation, employment growth. It allows a nation to respond to crisis on its own terms. To give up your currency is to give up a form of independence. And yet, by the 1970s, the ground began to shift. The global monetary system, the Bretton Woods system, collapsed. Currencies that were once fixed to the US dollar began to float. Exchange rates became unpredictable. Volatility increased for Europe. This wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous, because instability between currencies meant instability between countries. Trade became uncertain, planning became harder, and the fear of fragmentation began to return. So Europe faced a choice: accept volatility or eliminate it. And eliminating it meant something radical: fixing exchange rates, or eventually removing them entirely. This was the seed of the euro. But seeds don't grow in isolation, they need pressure, and that pressure came from politics. By the late 20th century, Europe was changing again. The Cold War was ending. Germany was reunifying, and with that reunification came unease, because a strong, unified Germany economically raised old concerns, not about war necessarily, but about imbalance. Europe needed a way to anchor Germany within a broader system, to integrate its power, rather than let it stand alone. And the euro became that anchor. A shared currency would bind Germany to Europe. It would make economic divergence harder. It would create mutual dependence at a level that went beyond trade agreements. But here lies the paradox. To gain collective control over their future, nations gave up control over their most powerful economic tool, their currency. Because once inside the euro, there would be no independent monetary policy, no adjusting interest rates based on national needs, no devaluing currency to restore competitiveness. Everything would be centralized, uniform, But Europe itself was not uniform. Germany had a strong industrial base, high productivity, and a cultural emphasis on fiscal discipline. Countries like Greece, Italy, and Spain had different economic structures, different cycles, different vulnerabilities. They didn't move at the same speed. They didn't respond to pressure in the same way. And yet, they were being placed under a single monetary system. It was like building a house on uneven ground and hoping the structure would stabilize itself over time. Some believed it would, that integration would lead to convergence, that weaker economies would catch up, that differences would fade. But not everyone agreed. Economists had already studied this kind of system. They called it the theory of optimal currency areas, and the conclusion was clear. For a shared currency to work, countries need either similar economic structures or mechanisms to compensate for their differences. Europe had neither. There was no central fiscal authority strong enough to redistribute resources effectively, no unified budget that could stabilize weaker regions during downturns. And yet, the project moved forward anyway. Why? Because economics wasn't the only force at play. Politics was stronger. Urgency was stronger. The desire for unity after centuries of division was stronger. Speed became more important than precision. Integration became more important than alignment. And in the quiet rooms where these decisions were made, compromises were accepted, limits were softened, criteria were adjusted, assumptions were made. Because the belief was powerful that once the system was in place, reality would adjust to fit it. But reality doesn't adapt to systems. Systems must adapt to reality. And when they don't, the consequences don't appear immediately. They build slowly, silently, because the euro wasn't born out of perfect economic logic. It was born out of necessity, hope, fear, and political ambition. It was designed to solve a problem. But in solving one problem, it may have created another, one that wouldn't become visible until years later, when the system was tested, when pressure began to build, when the assumptions met reality. Because creating a system is one thing, understanding how it behaves under stress is something else entirely. And that's where the real story begins. Not in why the euro was created, but in how it actually works. Beneath the surface, at first glance, the euro system looks almost elegant. One currency, one central bank, one unified monetary policy. It feels clean, efficient, controlled, but simplicity can be deceptive because beneath that clean surface lies a structure that is anything but simple. To understand it, imagine this. A group of countries steps into a single vehicle. They agree on a shared destination, stability, growth, unity. They even agree to share the same steering wheel. But here's the catch. Each country still controls its own brakes, its own fuel, its own engine, and no one is fully in charge. That's the euro system. The European Central Bank sets interest rates for the entire Eurozone. It controls the money supply. It determines the overall direction of monetary policy. But each individual country still manages its own budget, its own taxes, its own spending, which means one policy is applied to many different realities. And that's where the tension begins. Before the euro, countries had something like reflexes. If their economy slowed, they could lower interest, RATES, to stimulate growth. If their exports became too expensive, they could devalue their currency to regain competitiveness. If a crisis hit, they had the ability to respond quickly and independently. These weren't perfect tools, but they were flexible. The euro removed them completely and replaced them with a system where adjustment is no longer external, it becomes internal. Here lies the paradox. The euro created stability by removing flexibility, and flexibility is what allows systems to survive shocks, because no two economies are identical. Take Germany, highly productive, export-driven, industrially efficient. A stable currency works in its favor. It reinforces its strengths. Now compare that to Greece or Spain. Different economic structures, different productivity levels, different vulnerabilities. These economies needed something else. They needed room to adjust. But under the euro, that room no longer exists. There is no independent interest rate, no independent currency, no ability to devalue so. When imbalance appears, it cannot be corrected through the system. It must be absorbed, and absorption is painful. Because instead of currencies adjusting, people do wages fall, jobs disappear, public spending contracts. This process has a name: internal devaluation, and it's far more brutal than external adjustment, because when a currency devalues, prices shift. But when internal devaluation happens, society shifts, living standards decline, opportunities shrink. Entire generations feel the pressure, but this is only one layer of the system. The deeper issue lies in how capital moves. When the euro was introduced, something subtle happened. Financial markets began to treat all Eurozone countries as nearly equal. Greece could borrow at interest rates similar to Germany. Spain could access credit as easily as France. Risk appeared to disappear, and with that illusion came expansion. Cheap credit flooded into weaker economies. Banks lent aggressively. Governments borrowed more. Consumers spent freely. Growth accelerated. It felt like convergence, like the system was working exactly as intended. But it wasn't, because beneath the surface, the fundamentals hadn't changed. Productivity gaps remained. Structural differences persisted. Economic realities stayed unequal. Only the cost of borrowing had changed, which created a dangerous illusion. Because when money is cheap, problems don't disappear. They get postponed. And as capital flowed into weaker economies, something else happened simultaneously. It flowed out, quietly, invisibly, toward stronger economies. This is where mechanisms like target to come into play. You don't need to understand the technical details to grasp the effect. Think of it like this. Money naturally moves toward safety when uncertainty increases. Capital leaves weaker regions and concentrates in stronger ones. In the euro system, this process became amplified. Deposits shifted. Investments relocated. Financial flows tilted toward stability, and over time. Imbalances grew, not suddenly, not visibly, but steadily, like water collecting behind a dam on the surface. Everything still looked calm. Markets stabilized. Interest rates remained low. The euro appeared strong. But underneath, pressure was building because the system had no natural release valve. There was no currency adjustment to rebalance trade. No automatic fiscal transfer large enough to offset divergence. No mechanism to equalize the differences. Only accumulation. And this raises a critical question. What happens to a system that cannot self-correct? Because in nature, systems that can't adjust don't remain stable. They reach a threshold, and then they break. But the most dangerous part, the moment before they break, looks stable, calm, controlled, predictable, until suddenly it isn't. And when that moment came for the euro system, it didn't begin with chaos. It began with doubt, a shift in perception, a realization that the assumptions holding everything together might not be true, that not all countries were equally safe, that not all debts were equally sustainable, that the system wasn't as stable as it appeared. And once that doubt enters a financial system, it spreads, because confidence is not just a feature of markets, it is the foundation. Remove it, and everything else begins to move. Slowly at first, then all at once. And when the euro system was tested, when pressure reached its limit, the consequences didn't stay contained. They moved across borders, across institutions, across the global financial system itself, because the euro was never isolated, it was connected deeply. And when something deeply connected begins to strain, the effects don't remain local. They ripple outward, unpredictably, relentlessly, and that's exactly what happened next. By the time the euro began to